All right. It's our last speaker session for the day. I'd like to welcome Kevin Koehler. He's joining us from Automatic. And he is going to be talking to us about something I'm sure we've all experienced at some point or another, the care and feeding of open source skeptical colleagues. Thank you very much, Kevin.
Thank you. I'm very excited to be here today. But there were a lot of great talks, so you're all really tough acts to follow. So I have spent a lot of my career explaining software and open source to people in different capacities, but I have not worked in a newsroom context since college. So I'm really pretty interested to hear from all of you in the room. So I'm going to try to go through my spiel fairly quickly and leave lots of room for discussion at the end if you're interested and still awake. I think when starting to use open source software in an environment that's not familiar with those kind of things, we have to remember that open source is kind of pretty weird. It's an unusual way to work compared to the way that business has been done for centuries. This is my favorite little part of the GNU preamble, which is when we speak of free software, we're oh cool, it cut off. We're referring to freedom, not price, which is like show that to a business person and they will be completely lost and have no idea what you're talking about. And that kind of just cascades through all of our working with open source software. Is just like at a conceptual level, there's the wrong framework for it. So you need to kind of break it apart piece by piece. And the other thing to remember is that it is weird, so you need to be like super patient with people because there was a time when all this was probably pretty weird to you too. I guess unless you've been hacking on code since you were 12, which maybe all of you have, I don't know. But it's just a different way of thinking. So like patience is key. And the other thing is that it's going to be weird for people to trust something that's so unusual. So it's good to put kind of the specific fears to rest. I'm going to go through like probably kind of some of the things that people often complain about or are scared of open source about. And you've probably heard them all before. But one is that like open source, it's free. It's not really like trustworthy. That's not like a stable thing. And I think a good argument against that is helping people realize the extent to which software has taken over the world, and particularly open source software. Just about like every key framework, all sorts of software, from the computer server that holds your files to your phone to your laptop, runs in some capacity in open source. So every time someone opens a website or maybe turns on their internet-connected clock radio, they're probably using an open source technology somewhere in there. So if you can find out kind of with the person you're talking to, kind of how they approach technology, and then kind of run through all the different open source technologies that lets their day-to-day, that powers their day-to-day lives, I think it's pretty powerful to say that this is not like some kind of newfangled way of doing business. It's been done, developed over the entire history of the internet and software, which is, decades and decades long. The other one, which you've probably heard, is that it's, just for blogs, which is a myth we can't make die. Hopefully today you've heard you're familiar with like lots of really cool news and publishing websites that do all kinds of things that aren't even remotely bloggy, from magazines like Wired and People or data journalism like 538, or more content-heavy sites like the Washington Post and others all use WordPress in some capacity. So that should put it to rest, but also the latest W3 text number, which hopefully we all know, is that 28.5% of the internet runs on WordPress, or the top 10 million sites anyway, at least 28.5% run WordPress, which should be pretty comforting. That's not just blogs. There aren't that many blogs in the world. That's all kinds of websites. And there's a new the WordPress.org showcase, if you haven't seen it in a while, has been refreshed, and there's some pretty good sites in there, and they're always adding them. And if you want a final kicker, Beyonce's site is on WordPress. I think if it's good enough for Bay, it's good enough for you. Another thing you hear a lot, if someone's read read enough to be dangerous, is that WordPress is not secure. Because that gets printed in media sometimes, usually in a reductive way. But I think it's as secure as software can be. When other hosted closed platforms say they're secure, they're counting on security through obscurity, which is really no security at all. It's just you're less aware of the security vulnerabilities. There's less eyes on it. And so it's actually can be much bigger gaps in there. You just haven't heard of it. So security through obscurity is no security at all. The other reason that this continues on is that whenever WordPress sites get hacked, you get news stories about it because WordPress is a big brand. Everyone's heard of it. Maybe they've used it in a blog before. And so kind of anytime there's a few sites or a trend of sites anywhere, you get articles like this in the BBC from a few years ago, which is saying how WordPress is not secure. But if you read through it, the hack that this bot was using was sites that still have admin for username and admin for password, which is now much harder to do in WordPress. But it's also an indication that it's probably not like an enterprise kind of stack that they're breaking into. It's a lot of kind of low-hanging fruit gets compromised. So I think, and also you get a lot of sites that aren't updated, which is getting better with auto updates. Just update your sites. So I think the analogy that I would use for this, which a lot of you may not like, is WordPress is a little like the New York Yankees. It's the team everyone's heard of. And if Derek Jeter sneezed in the locker room last night, you hear about it on ESPN the next day, but you don't hear about the failings of the Montgomery Biscuits, which is my favorite minor league team, or the Toledo Mud Hens or whatever. It's just kind of a whole different level of scrutiny. So the fact that a PM or someone has read an article about how WordPress isn't safe is not really an indication of the insecurity of it, just the success and the fame of the software. The other thing that makes people uncomfortable, since there's not one person that owns WordPress, is that there's no one you can call, right? You want to call someone up on the phone, take them out to drinks, whatever, which is true, but that's really, in my opinion, it's not a bug, it's a feature. Because if there's no one you can call, it's also not one basket that you're putting all your eggs in and hoping their business continues to go well and hoping they continue to prioritize support and have good people on staff that speak your language. So there's not one person you can call, there's hundreds. There's a number of agencies that do this. There's lots of developers who are familiar with WordPress. So if something breaks or you need something, you just have way more options because there's no one you can call. And it makes it super easy in the long term to sustain your operation because it's going to make it really easy if you hire new people, they get up to speed. You're much more likely to have someone who's familiar with WordPress in your hiring pool than some proprietary Italian CMS that you paid too much money for and is not open. And also, easy to hire partners and outsiders. In addition to no one owning it, there's huge advantages to that ecosystem over the traditional model. And it's, I like to think of WordPress and a good open source stack as being like a 14-year head start. You probably could get your developers together and put a team together and rewrite an editor and a server and all those kind of things. But I don't know what, you could. You might come up with something pretty good, but there's lots of things that have been thought of, lots of little details you would never even imagine that have been developed and put into the software over these 14 years. So to use another analogy, it's kind of like starting a newspaper. And so I'm going to publish a new newspaper, and I'm going to start by buying a forest and building a paper mill. And we're just going to really go nuts and bolts. And I mean, that may be true. You may get the world's best paper, but is that really where you want to spend your money? Or do you want to spend your money, your time, and your developer resources building apps, putting into editorial, investing in the things that make your publication unique from all other publications? You can spend your time on the problems that everyone's solving, or you can go ahead and just get those out of the way and spend time on your unique problems and the things that make you special and exciting. Because really all of that is harder than it looks. So it's been a Waterloo for many talented teams deciding the text editor is the thing they want to do. Or WYSIWYG. Ooh. Okay, well, this is a little off on the formatting. But the other thing that scares people is GPL, which is a legal thing. And not to get too deep into the weeds, but it can seem to people like the GPL in particular is a more restrictive license, or there seems to be restrictions on it. It's a little scary if you're unfamiliar with it. But the GPL is, if you look back at the 4 freedoms of free software, which is a little distinct from the GPL, but I won't get into that. So kind of the principles that the GPL was written towards. Freedom 0 and freedom 1, the foundational ones is it gives you the freedom to take the code, use it, hack it, and put it to your own use. Those are kind of like the foundational freedoms that are at the heart of the whole license. And so what the GPL does restrict is redistribution of things that you fork and take down. I mean, it only restricts them in that you also have to pass a GPL license on. So in a lot of contexts, people are scared that it's going to stop them from hacking away or doing what they want. But really, the only point where a GPL becomes restrictive or instructive is when you go to redistribute that code and publish it in a new format for others to use. So if you're just going on one particular publication, it's really not something that you need to run into too often. And then because of the GPL, you fully own the code. There's no corporate entity involved in there. Automatic does not have fingers into your ownership structure. If companies that are invest a lot in WordPress go belly up tomorrow, if one of them does or gets bought by Microsoft, like no one can come in and take over and change the state of play because the GPL is one of the freer, maybe freest licenses or enforces the free software onto everyone who uses it. So it really can't go away overnight. And because there's a lot of businesses that are built using WordPress now, even if the project goes a direction you don't like someday, all the people who have a business built on it now can just fork it and use a different flavor, different branch of WordPress. So once you use it and deploy it, it's really a safety feature. That there's no threat to a change in to how a change in ownership might affect your code, which is unique and completely different from proprietary software. And I try to talk a lot about analogies because technology really is hard to make analogies out of. But I do think people who are unfamiliar with the software world kind of come at it with bad analogies or inappropriate ones. And I think even though WordPress has press in the title, the good analogy is not to a printing press. It's not to equipment. It's not to something you buy and is just encapsulated in one thing that lasts for 10 years and then you update it or what have you. So it's really not that. I think to use a kind of strained analogy, it's more like the Associated Press. It's a bunch of people getting together and saying, hey, look, we don't need to all repeat the same work. We'll have, one person in Beirut sending stories of Syria to all our newspapers, or we'll have one person looking at this particular part of the code that needs to be done for everyone, or we have a few people working on, AMP or Google Instant Articles, and we don't all have to recreate everything. So that's what you're really getting with when you buy into a good open source ecosystem like WordPress. So those are kind of some of the common myths and arguments that I hope is useful. And the other thing, if you are not new to using open source in your environment, there's a few things to know to get the most out of it. Just like briefly on security, there have been other security talks here that I won't go into, but please, everyone, use two-factor authentication, especially in the journalism context or the publishing context. Whether you like it or not, you're a target for some people and probably in a lot of cases. And your weakest link is always someone who has access, who hasn't secured everything. So you can do password hygiene and all that. And also really, it's about time you can enable 2FA. There are plugins that can do it. Technically, it's very easy for you to roll out. It just may take a little education internally. but it's super worth it. A lot of the hacks that happen are from one person who has not done their personal security very well, more so than bad code. And also, don't forget those point releases that may seem minor if you're new to WordPress, but like the feature releases sort of, or the 4.6, 4.7, 4.8. But those 0.1 releases fix bugs, they fix security errors. So it's really important that you update and leave auto updates on. And if you're doing something that makes auto updates makes you nervous to do auto updates, maybe look at that thing you're doing and not auto updates, because it's really keeps your site secure. So try to do them pretty quickly after they're released. It is an open source technology, so it's not for your particular situation, it's for everyone's situation. You will need to spend a little time optimizing it to your own needs. And it's not going to be, so you will need to invest some time in setting it up if you're like doing a major publication kind of launch. But that little, that investment and, scaling and optimizing and all the things that you've heard here this weekend are really, in the end, not that big compared with adopting other technologies. And it will pay you back with a big dividend. Pretty quickly, you can get up to a site that can scale widely. And it's good to do that for publishers who have a lot of breaking news scenarios and big spiky traffic. So it's much better to do that beforehand instead of when the pressure's on and everyone's wondering why things are breaking. And the other thing is to use and know plugins, which can be hard to do because there are really so many plugins available in WordPress. But a good plugin for you is not just the reputation that it has stars in the WordPress.org repository, or that it's in the WordPress.org repository. You need to dig a little deeper than that to see if it's reputable people behind it who are making regular updates, answering forum posts, all those kind of things, and if it's used in sites that are similar to your context. So there's a lot of great plugins that hopefully you've heard about this weekend or already know, and like TinUp and Alley Interactive and other agencies that do a lot of work with publishers and corporate clients put out really good plugins that are good for your use. And you know that there's a company behind it, not just a hobbyist. Although some of the hobbyist plugins can be pretty great too, if it's for your needs. And the other thing is, if you have time to do it and resources to do it, have someone just read through the code to see how a plugin actually works. It's way faster than writing it on your own, but having reviewed through it, you will see most of like the security or performance problems are probably pretty obvious to most developers if something just seems bonkers. And then knowing how it works will help you in compatibility and other things that you build on top of it down the road. So it's super useful if you do have a site where you have dev staff that's going to be on it continually, to have them actually read through some of the plugins. Maybe it's not understanding every little thing, but going through it is really beneficial. And then the other thing to using open source software is about in a newsroom or a client scenario yourself, you kind of need to optimize to the internal audience that you have within these organizations. So like a good content management system, a good website is like the air conditioning. You only notice with it breaks, right? And you don't want to just be noticed when something breaks, which websites inevitably have bugs. So don't let that success be quiet. It's good to brag about your successes, or if your website gets faster, or if having a good stack of open source technology allowed you to like build something new and cool really quick, be sure to brag about it to people that you know, whether it's a memo or in the office or in meetings. Really highlight those things. Bragging and that kind of thing is maybe not the easiest thing for some of us to do, but it will really pay dividends down the road if you want to invest more into WordPress or your stack, or go to conferences, or hire someone to do something cool. If WordPress and your website are things that come up frequently in people's mind as things that allow you to do successes, then you'll be better positioned to get money and resources for things than if it's just that website thing that you forgot about and it breaks occasionally. And probably the particulars of technology are not particularly interesting, but what it allows you to do. So, things like we refactor the code and it's smaller and more efficient. It's not as interesting as like we were allowed to do this story, or the page loads are faster, or we're seeing revenue go up or readership go up or time on page. Those kind of things are much more interesting. And so then the last thing is in contributing back to the open source world and the WordPress ecosystem. So that can also be pretty scary, even if you're a pretty experienced WordPress person. For one thing, everyone kind of thinks they're super unique, and they're maybe not as unique as maybe not as unique as you think you are. There are a lot of common problems, or even if you don't quite think of the problem in the same way, someone may have a solution that solves things similarly, or there may be other people who want to see how you would solve that problem. And putting out there can be really beneficial. I'll give you an example of something super obscure that it automatically open sourced, which is our terms of service, our copyright policies, our pre-written replies that we send to lawyers when they send us complaints. We put all of this up on GitHub under an open license, just because we default to open, and we'd rather throw something out there than keep it private. I really didn't think anything would come of it, but I mean, really all the time, people are writing in on our GitHub and correcting comma mistakes that we have, or offering to translate things for us, or asking pretty salient questions we hadn't thought of. And that's something we just put out with no promotion. We just published it out there. So think of things that you can open source, that you can put out there, even if it seems small, and then don't let it stop there. You can't just hit publish and expect people to know it. Tell people about it. Tell people that you've met here, in your Slacks and your news groups, or even internally around your newsroom or your agency. Let people know what you're working on, and it's out there. You might be pretty surprised at the things that you thought were unique to you weren't actually unique, or other people had interesting approaches to the problem. The other thing is working in public is scary, but it's okay. Everyone's code is ugly, probably even yours, and you're probably your own worst critic. I know I am when I write anything, which is rare, but nonetheless. You see all the mistakes, but when you're reading someone else's code, you're probably like, oh yeah, that's a little mistake, or that's not pretty or well documented. But other people will give you much more of a break than you probably think they will, and it won't damage your reputation to put stuff out there. It will improve your reputation to have stuff out there. And also the process of working in the open can make you document stuff better, can make you think about spelling out problems a little more clearly. And so really, even if no one particularly comes back and gives you contributions, you're being kind to your future self by thinking of working in the open instead of just rushing to get things out the door. And you're being kind to your colleagues by putting things out there and thinking from day one about being open. Internally, as for a newsroom or a publication or contributing to open source is a very long-term bet. It's not something where you're just going to hit something out in open source and then tomorrow, new revenue or free technology is just going to fall from the sky. So I think a lot of people think of it as a technology investment, and I think that's probably a bad analogy for contributing to open source. I think it's closer to a continuing education. The process of being involved in open source really ups your skills as a developer or the skills and knowledge that are on your team. It's also great for recruiting and your reputation. If you're a publication or an agency trying to hire people, it's going to really help if they can go and see your code. That's just the way you build trust of developers these days. So don't think of it as a technology investment that's going to solve a bunch of your problems tomorrow. This is something that in the long term is going to make your use of technology healthier. The other thing is maybe a lot of people think that if I'm going to open source something, it has to be a really cool product that everyone's going to use, the next WordPress or the next advanced custom fields or whatever. But really small pieces of code can be really useful and can really help you engage in the community and learn. So even if it's a few lines or just a little tweak or something that you changed in the admin or a little piece of jQuery or something, throw it out there and see what happens. You may be surprised. And then lastly, since some since some people deal with corporate lawyers who may be nervous about open source things, despite the great analogies that I gave earlier, don't let the license be a barrier. If you're putting on WordPress.org, you are expected to follow the GPL license, and that's the best one, and you should use it and strive for that. But if you're really blocked because of the license, better to get something out there under another license and be working and open in the community than just keeping it secret forever. GitHub, if you've never taken time to click around their resources about licenses, has really great explanations of all the licenses. There's a really simple explainer at chooseyourlicense.com. And if you have a lawyer friend who really wants to get into the reads, the softwarefreedom.org has a lot of great resources that actually deals into the legal things, which are super boring for most people, but lawyers will find it super interesting. The last thing, of course, is like, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. That's really a nice principle to have in your head. It's hard to do in practice. It's something I have to remind myself on a daily basis in all of my work. But open source software is really about failures and putting stuff out there and learning from mistakes. So if you're aiming for the perfect release, that's really kind of not how it works. Think of things that are good, things that can get out there, things you can be constantly improving on, instead of you're going to get the perfect release, the end state, the one thing. Software is always, continually being created. So good is better than perfect, and WordPress is not perfect, but it is pretty good. WordPress itself is not perfect, so you don't need to be perfect either to put stuff out there and help improve it. So that all went by pretty quickly. So I would like to open it to discussion if you're interested and still awake. We have a microphone here that'll come to you, and it'd be great if you have a particular problem explaining or adapting open source software to your situation. Why don't we just throw it up, and maybe people in the room have ideas. I'd be happy to answer questions. Or if you've solved a problem, I'd love to hear about that. Again, I encourage you to brag in this room as practice for bragging later.
For anybody looking at stuff as you're talking about it, it's choosealicense.com.
Oh, okay.
So I just did that, and I was like, oh, that's weird. Did I misspell something? And I'm like, oh, no. So it's choosealicense.com, not chooseyourlicense.com.
I appreciate that.
No problem.
The presentation's not perfect. I'll correct that before I put it online anywhere.
What else?
I just wanted to say thank you for the open source terms of service. That saved us literally weeks of effort and lawyer bills, and so thanks so much for that.
That's great to hear. Yeah, we hoped people would use it, but didn't really know if anyone would, and we hear all the time about how people use it. So it's a great example of opening anything up. Well, not anything, but almost anything is good.
Don't be shy.
Okay.
So this is a bit of a tangent, but I think relevant. If you are starting an open source project, you want people to contribute too. So you say, I take pull requests. What else do you do beyond that to get people to contribute to your project? Which is maybe good, but not yet good, and definitely not perfect.
Yeah, that's a hard problem of open source software, isn't it? But I think it's setting the right expectations. Because usually things start small and grow over time. Once upon a time, WordPress was pretty small, and it was just two bloggers hacking around on stuff. And there certainly wasn't a huge community of people reviewing things at that point. So I think like I said, you can't just publish. You need to talk to people who might use it and really engage with people online and offline. But things tend to build on themselves and grow slowly. So if you're looking for an open source thing to just really end up in instant contributions or people really engaged, that won't happen because it takes a while for people to see it, know what it is, adopt it, try it out, learn enough that they can talk back and have a pull request. All those things are really, really kind of long-term bets. So it's a hard one, but try to put yourself not in the shoes of what you think is good, but how different kinds of people might think your project is good and what would appeal to them, and then go after that. But I think the benefits are really, to open source software, are really long-term in almost every case. Things are not overnight, I guess, unless you're Facebook or something, and you've invested tens of millions of dollars in something. So I think it's kind of more about putting yourself in the shoes of users, not users, or potential contributors, and also kind of not taking your expectations too high too early. You have to build like really small building blocks, like one little bit at a time, and that eventually pays off. Does anyone else have any thoughts on that? All right.
Okay. In that case, let's give Kevin a round of applause.